Okay, well, I guess I can start talking. So we're in the final week 4, and I just want to start by saying thanks for having me and for doing this. I've had a really wonderful time, and you're not getting course credit for this, so you've shown up, and I really appreciate you being here and doing it. Yeah, like I said, it's just been really affirming for me, really life-giving, actually, to be able to spend my weeks kind of just pouring into some material and then being able to share it with you. I just feel like it's a real gift. So I really appreciate your being here. And I'm also interested in just what the future holds in doing more. This doesn't, this might be the last week of this one, doing the why statement, but I think Gavin and I will continue to talk, and we'll see what we can do, So, yeah, thanks very much. I also just wanted to share some news for myself, and especially because I believe in the power of prayer, and if you're the praying type, then I would appreciate your prayers. On March 14th, I am going to be defending my thesis. Finally, the date has been set. I actually have it. This is it. This is 5 years of my life, 5 and maybe almost 6, actually. And it'll all be done on March 14th, hopefully, I say hopefully, I think so. So just, keep that in mind as you're going. This is kind of the culmination for me of the last big thing, and then onward and upward, right? So there it is. So today we're in the final stage of the why statement. We choose to be real, relevant, and authentic. Christ is relatable to others because he is relevant to us. And so the theme that I wanted to look at here was relevance. And I think to begin, the word relevant is a bit of a buzzword. I mean, they're all kind of buzzwords, but relevant again is one of these amorphous terms that we got to be careful, I think, with what we do with it, because there's sometimes this inclination that we have to keep up with the culture to such a degree that we can end up accommodating ourselves in ways that we don't want to, right? And that's kind of been a theme, I think, through these last 4 weeks, hasn't it? Right? As we've gone through the early church and recognizing where Christianity emerges, and it doesn't appear in a vacuum, and you have competing and different beliefs and all these things going on. What does it mean to be relevant? It's interesting, I think, the way that the statement adds to it. Christ is relatable to others because he's relevant to us. Bringing the fullness of Christ into this is really the important thing, and this idea of being relatable. I would almost want to say that you could even reverse that statement and it would be equally true. Christ is relevant to others because he's relatable to us. The more we, this could be kind of a thesis for today, that the more we live in relation to each other, the more relevant we'll be. That relevance itself might not be the thing we're after. That it's not that we're trying to focus ourselves on how do we maintain relevance in the culture, but how do we maintain strong relations? How do we become more like Christ, to put it very simply, such that our relationality, the community that emerges, that we build here, becomes by nature a relevant place? I think it's a question we all have to put to ourselves, that if we can't think of why we're relevant, if we don't each have an individual answer for that, of like, why do you matter? Then I would challenge us to think bigger about the fullness of Christ, what that means. And that's, again, maybe a little bit of what I want to explore today, and where we've been going, I think. I think what this series is sort of pointed at is Christ he doesn't just represent one monolithic thing over here to the side that is either dealt with or not dealt with, in a sense. If Christ is the Logos, the reality of Christ is a universal humanism, if you will. It encapsulates all things. One of the issues I think we find so often, especially in the Protestant world, is that we've moved into this stage of individual salvation. We always think of our salvation as being an individual project. And we're going to talk a little bit about that transition in history, especially in the Romantic period after the Enlightenment. The rise of individualism. The rise of a sort of idea of control over our natural world and the universe. It forced Christianity, I think, in many ways, into a more tribalistic notion of religion. It's given us a kind of sense of religion today as something that we either, religion's either good or bad, and we can kind of put it over here. It's a privatized faith, Is that really how we can define what religion is? I've sort of raised this a few times, but I believe in a sense all human beings are religious by nature. Religion isn't a thing you have the option of doing away with. It's something that you either have more of, in a sense, of a lesser or greater quantity, if you will. That religio means to bind, and it is this sense in which we are all dealing with a spiritual reality. Where we kind of ended last week was with Dallas Willard talking about this very thing. Dallas Willard, in his book Renovation of the Heart, one of his main kind of arguments that he's using there is we are all spiritually formed. You all have a spiritual formation. That's not an option. The question is, how are you spiritually formed? And how do we continue to form ourselves? And so this is kind of where I wanted to begin. I'll start with Scripture, because I always want to just begin with something. This is what kind of came to me this week as I was just going through some things. There's so much from Scripture that you could pull and try and use. But Hebrews 11:6, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. I think we need to have faith in the fact that we are relevant, that we do matter, that the church matters, the local parish matters. I don't mean just church in the capital C sense of the universal church. Of course, that is also relevant. But what you're doing here matters. And it is relevant to the world. It provides meaning in an increasingly meaningless existence. And I want to talk about that as well. I'm not sure how quickly we'll get to it, but when we talk about certainly the space we're in right now, modernity and post-modernity, those terms, this is the exploration, this is what I want to look at today, is really what space do Christians occupy now? What type of world do we find ourselves in, and how has it changed? That's been kind of the work of a lot of the texts that I've brought up. So people like Charles Taylor, who wrote A Secular Age. I mentioned on I think it was the suggested reading in week 1, was a book by James K.A. Smith called How Not to Be Secular, which is a sort of condensed version of that. A lot of my interest stems from that guy and his work, Charles Taylor specifically. Understanding secularity, understanding the relationship of religion to an increasingly secular world. What does secular mean also? Is secular just a religion? A religious, as in like without religion? That's the notion that's being challenged. That secularity is not a subtraction theory. That's how Taylor puts it. It's not a subtraction story. And this is how the atheists of today often will characterize it this way. That, again, religion is something we can just do away with. Religion poisons everything. Religion's bad. And once we get rid of religion, we'll have what's left is the secular. And that's sort of the dominant secular thesis. Well, that's being challenged by people like Taylor, and I think he's right. Secularity is not a subtraction narrative, it's an achievement of society, actually. That we've actually come to a place where the secular arises out of our religious ethos. It's a sort of parasitic version of a religious understanding. It's an ideology. And what's been the fruit of that? What's actually happened I don't think it's good. I think we're moving. You can argue that these problems have always kind of been there in history, that we have moral corruption and all kinds of negative things happening, but I truly think it's getting worse in many ways. I'm not trying to say that as a pessimist, but there's some value in being a pessimist about these things. One of the things that the church brings to the world is a sort of moral center. And without it, our systems can't sustain themselves on their own. Democracy needs something more than just democracy, if you will. You'll see this often when you talk about certain economic changes, for instance, or the way in which just historical movements have shaped history. Something like the welfare state. Well, if you look at this, you look at basic economics. A guy named Thomas Sowell, for instance, wrote a book all about this. And he looks at the welfare state and he says, well, the welfare state crippled the black communities in Harlem in the 1960s. Okay? They were doing much better in the 1930s. It got worse. The welfare state is in many ways bad for society. But part of the reason why that might be the case from an economic standpoint is because historically, the church was the welfare state. The church was the initial, right? What did I say about, when we're talking about the early church, when Constantine came to the throne, all that stuff happened. I mean, the primary goal of bishops was to shepherd a flock of people, to help the poor and the oppressed. The problem is when you remove the church and you put all of that in the hands of just the state, well, then the human being isn't looked at in a holistic sense. They're looked at as, here's this amount of money and there you go. Well, that's not enough. Right? And so these are I'm just using that to sort of illustrate some of the things that we're talking about when we talk about a secular society, living in a post-Christian age. I mean, some might question that. Are we really living in a post-Christian age? In many ways, yes, certainly in the West. And that's an important thing to understand, is that we've moved through this era of, 2,000 years of Christian history that has impacted us. What do we look like on the other end? And maybe I use this illustration. Has anybody here seen the movie Moneyball? Yeah, you're aware of this movie with Brad Pitt. It's based on a true story of him trying to build up the Oakland A's baseball team, right? And it's sort of the point in the movie is that the Oakland A's have far less money than all the other organizations, right? The New York Yankees are just flush with cash. They can buy any player they want. They're poaching their players. And Brad Pitt is faced with this dilemma of going, I can't build a baseball team that can compete with the New York Yankees. We need to think differently about how we go about the job here. And so he creates a whole kind of system based on this idea of, what's the main focus? Well, we just need people to get on base. We're looking at the game all wrong. And I think that's a good illustration of a sense of what we're doing here in a post-Christian age as the church, is that we have to look at the game differently. In many ways, it's a real uphill battle, the way if you were trying to compete with culture. That's not really the way to do it. What's our actual goal? And keep in mind, I think part of the analogy there is like in the movie Moneyball, again, what he did there by implementing a new system was he didn't reinvent the game of baseball. Okay? It's still about hitting the ball, getting on the base, right? He's not changing that. There's an essence to what Christianity is that will never change. In many ways, we have to think more and more about how, in innovative ways, how we communicate the very same gospel that we've always had. There's nothing about that that's going to change. Nothing needs to change about that. Perhaps another actually suggested reading I should have gave was Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. Anybody aware of that work? G.K. Chesterton is... Depending on who you ask, I guess he can be a bit of a polarized figure, but he wrote a book called Orthodoxy, and to me, it's one of the greatest theological works. I don't want to oversell it, but the way in which he deals with the excitement and the exhilaration of orthodoxy, that we tend to think of that as something that's very stuffy and, this is all tradition, this is the old ancient regime, okay? No, it's this exciting place of creativity. It's this incredible place of flourishing. And this is, again, what I've been trying in some ways to communicate, that in the person of Jesus Christ, who is the Logos, there is an infinite set of modalities, is the term I like to use, that there are infinite ways of expressing that truth without descending into relativism. That's actually possible. And that if we can see that a little bit clearer, that we can see what's the story we're telling. I like to put it in those terms. What's the narrative that we're telling ourselves about Christian history and faith and where we are? That there's a lot of option here, if you will. There's a lot of freedom. I always want to go back to that. Galatians 5:1, Paul says, it's for freedom's sake Christ has set you free. At the end of the day, the gospel is giving us life and life abundantly. We need to learn how to communicate that to people, because I don't think, I'm sure you'd agree, I don't think that's what people see when they see the church. And largely, we have to own that. I think we have to own our history. We have to own the fact that Christians historically have been pretty bad at doing this. Now, I don't want to paint it with such a broad brush. Again, I tried to talk about in previous weeks this idea that once the church and state kind of get involved with each other, you end up with a lot of problems in the sense that not everyone's a theologian, and the state takes precedent over understanding what does it mean to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That's sort of put to the back burner, if you will, for more different kinds of reforms in society. This leads to a lot of problems. Now, I can't just blame it all on that. I'm not trying to just push it completely to saying, well, those weren't real Christians. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to give it that line of thinking. But it's that blending, this kind of sense in which Christianity has pervaded the Western ethos for so long, that one of the secular theories that emerges there, it comes from a guy named David Martin, actually, who talks about this, is that what we end up with, and actually I have a line on it, so I'll just go to it, is that the world's left with a set of mutations of Christian themes that have reused the Christian repertoire in the course of attacking it. That's something I think I want to unpack a little bit and try and understand. Is that does that make sense to people? I mean, I'm making sure everyone's kind of tracking, or if you have clarifying questions, do ask. But this idea that because Christianity has imposed a certain kind of moral sensibility on the world that has largely been adopted almost unwittingly by most of society. And what in turn happens is that when you see certain social movements that have arisen out of secularity itself, they're often taking elements of that Christian virtue and then using it itself to attack the sort of institutional form of the church itself. So even the things that if we're talking about the culture war, which I don't encourage engaging in any real serious sense, but if you're talking about the kind of polemical state of things, then us versus them mentality that's happening, so much of what people are fighting for is deriving all of its value and virtue from Christianity itself and mutating it. And this is sort of how, go to a biblical understanding of how evil works. How does Satan work, right? He takes the good and perverts it. Evil can't create. This is like a foundational kind of theology 101 thing when we talk about, now some people might dispute it, but it's been pretty foundational for the entire tradition of the Christian faith, that evil itself is the privatio bona, the absence of the good. It's not a thing in and of itself. It is the nothingness. Karl Barth called it das Nichtig, right? The nothing. Evil it doesn't mean that it's not real in the sense that you don't have to deal with it, but it's a sort of negative reality. Interesting, right? We wrestle with that. That's not just something that's going to be so clear cut. That's kind of where I'm coming at to all this today. I have to be honest with you. It's not like I have some magical answer for how the church can suddenly redeem itself and become relevant. I have a few ideas. I have a few ideas of things that I think are actually deeply important that we might be missing. And one of them actually relates to this idea that the church in general is a place of ritual and ceremony and symbol. And we live in a culture that has actually become more and more symbolically poor, ritually poor. It doesn't engage in the same way in these kinds of behaviors that put images in front of us that are actually edifying Christian images. That was kind of, last week's talk, Colossians 3:1, right? Set your mind on the things that are above. I'm sorry, my computer just went to a screensaver there. when you go to Dallas Willard, where we ended last week, and I just want to touch base on that again, this is kind of one of Willard's main focuses, where he's talking about how does the Christian undergo spiritual transformation, which then works outward into relevance and servanthood and all this sort of stuff. But how do we affect change within our own lives? One of the main things that Willard wants to talk about is the images that you put before yourself. The fact that these things impose on us all kinds of things that we unwittingly take on, and that we should actually pay attention to their importance. It's like if you were to interview people on the street and ask them about the impact of advertising, most people, and as a matter of fact, I saw a survey that said 9 out of 10 people will say that advertising doesn't really affect them, right? Because they're like, and the reason why is because they think that for advertising to work, it needs to have an immediate effect. Well, when I see the Coca-Cola ad, it's not like I get thirsty right away. That's not what Coke's trying to do. Coke's just trying to hit you with enough images that eventually when you do get thirsty, Coke's going to pop into your mind. Okay? Well, that's what's happening to a lot of us in our culture. It's happening all the time. You're bombarded with certain images. The church is a place where those images look distinctly different, or at least it should be. And Willard was pretty big on this. What sort of things are we putting before ourselves as a sort of practice that then leads into this place of spiritual transformation? So ritual becomes deeply important in that way. Yes, you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to comment on the transformation aspect.
Yeah.
I've been quite fascinated with this whole, topic, and a lot of, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Is a lot of it, I think, in our culture, and we've learned that we are to try to become, rather than believing that God says you are. You are redeemed. You are holy. You are set apart. And as we believe that and receive it, then we start to become it, because He transforms our mind. But we try to do it in our own strength. We try to become moral, and and that just leads to striving, which is not faith.
You're right.
So we have to believe by faith what God says about us. That gives us our identity. Then from that, He can work through that. But I think we don't have any idea. I know I work quite a bit with identity with women. Yeah. And it's shocking. These mature Christian women that I work with, they have no sense of their identity. And it's not something we have done well, and it's something we need to work on, and it's so true. If you know who you are and who He says you are, then anything is possible, because He can, He says, eagerly desire the spiritual gifts. That's another thing we don't do. Right. We have settled in North America and in the culture church for the very minor operation of the Spirit. And we don't even expect Him to show up with the gifts of the Spirit. But He says eagerly desire it, and don't settle for it. And we settle. We're content with the way we've seen it happen. But I read a story about a lady in North Africa, and move of the Spirit was happening. There was a huge, amount of healing, whatever. And she was crying out to God to say, why don't we see this in North America? And He said, it's fear of man. It's the fear of man is the reason things don't happen. There's a little fear of God, but there's a real big fear of man, pleasing, Anyway, that's on my heart, really, is to see the Spirit move here.
There's a lot of truth in everything you're saying. Yeah, when you said no, that's really helpful. Actually, I think it made me think. Immediately, Psalm 46, "Be still, know that I am God," is also really translated, "Cease striving, and know that I am God." And this goes a little bit actually to what I've been saying about evil as privation. When we talk about ourselves and who we are, we tend to actually think of ourselves already sort of complete in and this is part of the shift that's happened in thinking about the individual self in the modern age, is we see a self-sufficiency, right? But in actuality, who we are. You see, if sin and evil, it's not I who sin, but sin that lives in me. If those things are privation, that's not who you are. And who you are is this realized being within the person of Christ. You see, and that's such an important understanding, is that who you actually are can't even really be known until the end. And that we find ourselves in the person of Jesus. That's why you understand, I always use the term teleology. Is everybody familiar with this? I'll just say telos, right? A telos or a teleology is an end point, right? So like, what is the natural movement of the human being? What's its end point? Where is it? If you put a seed in the ground, it becomes a tree. Its teleology is to become the tree. Our teleology is to become Jesus, not just like Jesus, right? I don't want to mince words there. You're not going to be Jesus, but Jesus, it takes on human flesh. This is again why Dallas Willard was so important for talking about human nature, and why understanding those early church movements, Nicaea and whatnot. The huge concern they have is not simply in giving you some sort of moral platitudes. Okay. The Apostles' Creed isn't a set of moral arguments. It's a set of confessions about Christ as Lord. And why that's so important is that if Christ adopts human nature, our teleology is in the person of Jesus, right? God became man that man become God. Kenosis, the self-emptying of Christ, is also the theosis of human nature. Theosis is the other term, by the way. That's the sort of... So, there's an interesting book written just by David Bentley Hart, kind of a provocative title called You Are Gods, right? But that's Christ who says that. You are gods. What does he mean? You are not ho theos, the God. Or sorry, is it the other way around? My Greek's terrible. You are not God, but you are of the image of God, right? Your image is found, your teleology is found in the person of Christ. All things in creation that have been called good find their endpoint in Jesus. That's the relevance and the message of the Christian gospel. So often, the way that Christianity is presented to the world is, here's a set of dogmas that if you don't adopt, you're going to spend eternity away from God in hell. That narrative is old hat. You can't. Not only is it wrong, but it's just like the PR on that's pretty bad. You're not going to be able to sell that to anybody. Okay, that doesn't work. What story are we telling ourselves? What's the narrative? And if we move away from this idea that the Logos of Christ, it doesn't come to simply redeem my individual self, but to redeem creation. Okay, the restoration of all things. There's a term used in Acts, apokatastasis, that refers to this: the renewal and restoration of all things. That one in 1 Corinthians 15, that God will be all in all. What does that mean? This is a far more holistic understanding of the Christian faith. And again, that's what I want to always return to, is this dialectic between the specificity and particularity and the universal notion of Christianity. That Christianity can have its distinct confessions, but that in those distinct particular confessions, we find a massive inclusiveness that does away with tribalism, that does away with an us and them. There is no us and them. There is I and thou, right? It was a famous work by a Jewish writer, Martin Buber, I, thou, okay? You are constituted by otherness. That's part of your relevance, right? And that's the doctrine of the Trinity. That's why we don't worship, we worship God in three persons. And I talked about that as well, just understanding the logic that God is a social reality in himself. And you're made in that image. Okay, so a couple of big ideas there. Does anyone have other questions, by the way, before I kind of carry on? Or we go into some more historical kind of stuff as we explore this. But I felt last week, I really enjoyed last week. I thought everybody was kind of getting a lot out of it, at least. And I have to admit, I didn't plan as much. You and I were talking about that actually a couple of weeks ago, just saying sometimes you have a direction, you want to say what you want to say, but I want to leave it open as well. I want to see where the Spirit leads, especially in this final week. It's obvious, it's true, I'm sure you all know, we're barely even scratching the surface of any of this stuff. I mean, like, you'd fill a whole library with just, the Council of Nicaea or something like that. Well, what I have written on this page is kind of another timeline that reaches across such a vast period. I mean, we're jumping now from basically the 5th century all the way up to the 18th. Well, a lot happens there, okay? We're not going to be able to get into it. But I want people to be aware of sort of what are these big moments that have happened that have brought Christianity to the space that it is. I mean, how do we understand ourselves now in relation to the world? How does the world see the Christian faith? Because if we don't understand that, then how can we ever diagnose? How can we ever communicate ourselves properly? It's one of the reasons I put a timeline at the end of this. I wanted to get into some more art stuff as well because I thought that was good. But this, I wanted to just create a basic timeline. I should write out another one actually here on the board in a second, but turning points, just big things that have happened so people get an understanding of certain dates and periods. 325 Nicaea also comes along with Constantine, sort of on the rise of Constantine. That's a major kind of turning point. We often think of Christianity in the first 300 years and then after that. So that's like one chunk at least that we could divide. 476, the fall of Rome. When you get into about the year 500, you're now entering into the Dark Ages. And we talked about this as well last week. I brought up a quote from G.K. Chesterton about the fact that actually Christianity is the light that spans across the Dark Ages. It is such a commonplace theory, whatever, idea out there, certainly in academia, that the Dark Ages were really Christianity's fault. People talk about it like it's just, that's just obvious, and I think that's completely wrong. The reason why they say that is, again, because Christianity takes hold during that period of time, and you do have a Christian state suddenly, and they're trying to work out, well, how do we do any of that? Christian morals are very fragmentary for society, if you will. Because it's almost impossible to look at the Sermon on the Mount and then think about how you would put that into a political system. It doesn't really work that way, does it? Or at least it's not so clean and simple. So Constantine has a lot of, for instance, Constantine is doing all kinds of things that are still very Roman, right? He's still killing people. He's still doing and that gets brought now together with Christianity. I was watching a movie last week, King Arthur, like an old Clive Owen movie. Has anyone seen that? And it's just, it hits me, like the Roman soldiers have the Pax Romana. They have the Cairo, the symbol of Christ on their shields. And you go like, that was a real period of history where the Roman Empire thought they were Christian, right? And you kind of go like, what is good in that? Anything, right? And that's why you have these narratives of decline that continue to happen. Is like, did everything get bad then, or when did it happen? Who's to blame, right? This is, by the way, a prominent dissertation thesis, is just pick one figure in history and then blame them for everything. And it works really well. And I would like to actually kind of talk about that. I've mentioned there's a few names here and people we can mention. I am really of the belief that it is not people who have, it's not like René Descartes comes on the scene and suddenly you have the Enlightenment. It's that the Enlightenment is a movement that's happening within the culture. It's sort of a groundswell. Everybody's minds are kind of moving in this direction. And a figure like René Descartes arrives as somebody who articulates that particular moment very well. But it is not, sometimes we put too much emphasis on the individual again and think, oh, everything changed after René Descartes came. Well, no, not quite, right? I don't, that's a narrative of decline, and they're often false. You can't just put everything at the footstep of somebody like that. So 500 is the beginning of the Middle Ages, but also the Dark Ages. They kind of coincide. Dark Ages last until about 1000, so it's that 500 years, and then you have yes? And then 1500 would be the end of the Middle Ages, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So you can't put everything to one area, but you certainly, those are based on the comment you made, you sort of asked the question, how we actually kind of, from a Christian standpoint, now are things getting better? And your comment was, I'm not so sure. And I wonder if the issue is, as you look at each of these dates, although you can't put at the feet, that's where the problem began, you can certainly say that every single one of those builds on where we're at today.
Yeah, for sure.
So my question is, have we ever seen the Sermon on the Mount lived out after Jesus died?
Oh, I think so in many places, in many parts. I want to be careful and clarify what I was saying, like my pessimism about sort of where we are when I'm looking at society and its sort of moral fabric and its moral center, you can argue those problems have been there forever. What I'm saying is, in general, with Christianity is eroding its sort of particularities within culture, and more you are just seeing, you're seeing mutations and perversions of a bygone Christian ethic. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to say Christianity is somehow in a worse place or a better place. It's not necessarily about that. The Sermon on the Mount has been lived out by there's a reason why Christianity survives this period, but it's not always the loudest, right? It's not always the main thing that's being given attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that?
I guess I would say that I'm not convinced that Christianity has progressed the way Jesus wanted it to. Although I also would say, because when I look at some of the figures of, for me right now, Mother Teresa, as I go back, there's always going to be a remnant. But,
for sure.
And
there's great work being done now. I don't want to just...
But would you say that North America, I feel that North America, we're in a bit of a pickle.
I do too.
I don't know how we live out Jesus' teachings within the Christian world. I would say that in my time, it's very rare to see churches that have really lived out what Jesus has wanted us to do.
That's, exactly. And I share that same sentiment of I think we are in a bit of a pickle. And part of the reason why is because of this. Again, I keep using the term social imagination, because the social imaginary of the culture doesn't really, first of all, has forgotten in a sense what the Christian faith actually is and stands for. It's represented now by groups and factions and denominations, whatever you want to call it, groups of people who themselves, I don't think, really understand or can articulate what Orthodox faith looks like. Now, that might be too sweeping. I think, I think about the theology that I've adopted and the way it looks different than a lot of other people. Well, many people share my point of view. They're out there, but it's not the dominant stream, if you will, right? I mean, when people look at Christianity today, they typically see things like Trump's evangelical America, right? I mean, that's the PR you're dealing with. So that's what I'm trying to wrestle with. And in a sense, one of the reasons why I think we're in such a bad place is because I'm never going to blame secular culture for the problems of the Christian faith. I'm going to own it you're right. I think the work needs to be done within our churches. It's we need to reform ourselves. We're not going to, why it's kind of going to what Paul had said in his epistles. Is why would I care what the non-believer does? Until they actually make a confession of faith and are considered my brother and sister in Christ, only then can I begin to correct you, and we can talk together about, this is the way to go. So my battle is not with the atheism of today. As a matter of fact, I understand it. I go of course, I don't know if I would be a Christian without my formation, because if I were coming at it from where you're coming at, I just wouldn't get on board. There's no way, because no one's given me the right narrative. My battle is with the Trump evangelical America. It's with the Christian nationalist. It's with the people who are turning it into a dogmatic expression of individual salvation. Unless you say the sinner's prayer, you're going to hell for eternity. It's give me a break. This is not the narrative that Christ gave us. This is not the gospel. Yeah, there's so many places to go. That's why, like I said today, I got to leave this open because there's so many places. Like I don't want to now just jump into talking about scholasticism out of nowhere, right? I mean, yeah, I'm more dealing with the relevance. What do you think is relevant about the Christian faith? What narrative have you been told? So I hope that kind of brings some, like it's a tough question, but I'm just dealing with the sense of like, yeah, how do we respond? What do we do? I think for me, I see in, certainly by exploring the doctrine of kenosis, for instance, I see more of an emphasis actually on bringing ourselves within the limitations of the great tradition of actual liturgy practice, the church, and allowing them to become irrelevant to the culture. And because it won't remain that way. Yes.
So, but the beauty of the essence of God is that ultimately the Holy Spirit burns through all of that. So that whether or not the person in front of you feel that you can be, if you sat and had an intellectual conversation, you probably wouldn't agree, but ultimately that person's seeking God too, whether they know it or not, because we all are. And eventually,
That's right, yeah.
You know, when the Holy Spirit is moving, eventually that became, you know, more and more becomes clear that person is, they know they're seeking.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what they're seeking, but they're seeking. And they see something in you.
Absolutely.
They don't have.
And that's what I think, and that's kind of what I'm saying, is that it's, you know, again, one of the reasons why I brought Dallas Willard into it is because Willard's emphasis, again, is on this, the individual transformation, right? It's sort of taking the sayings of Jesus as when Jesus says, before you remove the mote in your brother's eye, right? Remove the beam out of your own. It's kind of using that as a foundational text to be like, you can't reform the world until you've figured yourself out in at least the sense that you've committed, you know, you've become humble in your walk with Christ, that until you sort of, you know, he's got these patterns of development of like, this is how it works, out of the spirit, out of the will, out of the heart, then that shapes our thought and our feelings, which move into the body and then move into the social. The Holy Spirit does. It cuts through those. You have to be able to find that. If you can't get to that center, then you have nothing to offer. You know, you can't give the Holy Spirit to other people. You have to be salt and light. And so it begins with a sort of personal transformation that works outwardly, and then that's where relevance emerges. That's where relation is built, if you will. But it's that process. We have to, and what's interesting, here's the paradox of it, and this is what's important, is that the work of the self is the denying of the self. And that is it. And that's exactly what Willard does, is that he's going, one of those, you know, according to the David Martin secular thesis, one of those mutations of Christianity is actually an egocentrism. And it's a confusion of saying, we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, I don't ever do work on myself. That's not what it is. The point is that through a Christocentric lens, to work on myself means to take on my cross, to deny myself. The only work of the Christian is to sort of forget themselves within that process, right? So that's a paradoxical view of what it means to focus on development. Did you want to say more on that? Yeah, I hit it. Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, it's cruciform.
And it's not a popular concept in the church or in the world. Dying to self is not fun.
And it's a very hard thing to conceptualize. I think that's part of it, is like, what do we mean by that? What does it actually mean to die to self?
I had to do a little devotional this week, and this is what it was on the wilderness experience and the motive of the wilderness experience. It was just a 10-minute thing. But even in reference to your dying to self in terms of prayer and fasting and giving. Those are the three things that were mentioned in the passage. And, you know, dying to self to realize that we're stewards of what we have. We don't own this. God gave it to us, so it's His. But we tend to often, I mean, it's a growth process to learn that these finances are not mine, they're yours, Lord. How do you want me to use them? You know, like that. That's one
It's very important. As a matter of fact, I'll mention this, another major work, one that I'm working through right now, is a book called The Enchantment of Mammon by a guy named McCarraher. Massive book, and quite dense, so if you are interested in it, I suggest you look him up actually on YouTube if you want to hear like a good lecture by somebody. He is challenging Charles Taylor's secular theology thesis. So if Taylor in his book basically made the case that secularity arises as a sort of not a subtraction narrative, as I said, that's the language he uses, but we've gone from a period of time, let's say 500 years ago, put it very simply, 500 years ago everybody believed in God, now nobody does. Okay, that's kind of the general starting point for Taylor. McCarraher is saying, no, God has not been removed, he's been misplaced, and he's moved to mammon, he's moved to riches and worldly wealth. And this is a very hard thing for people in the church to absorb and to understand that in many ways, what McCarraher is saying is that because of global capitalism, and yeah, he's going into that economic kind of stream of thinking, we have just really began to worship gold and silver again. We've moved into that form of idolatry. God hasn't disappeared, he's changed places, if you will. At least our idea of God, right? Because that's not really good.
Can you say that name again?
Yeah, McCarraher. Let me just make sure I have this name exactly right. The Enchantments of Mammon was the book. The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism, what was it called? How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity. Eugene McCarraher. And so it's, McCarraher. It's a weird name. He's an interesting guy. I won't go in too much on that, but that's again another one of these massive works in the sort of secular theses, secular theories that are emerging, and a really important one because this is something that Christians like adopting this idea. How do we die to self? Well, right now, if you look at most mainstream, certainly evangelical Christian thinking, they're doing seminars on how to be an entrepreneur. It's just like something doesn't fit here. And it doesn't mean that means that being an entrepreneur is bad. I'm not trying to say that, but it's going like, what's the focus here? I think sometimes this is touchy stuff. We sometimes take Jesus' teaching about it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle. And we say, well, that has to do with the attachment to possessions that the person had. And it's like, it's actually a little bit more starkly put than that. It's basically saying you actually can't be wealthy in that way. Because how does one resist? How does one actually devote themselves to a godly life and live with worldly riches in that way? The fact that Donald Trump sees there no contradiction between the absolute unbelievable wealth he has and then trying to be this proponent of evangelical theology is just crazy. Anyway, that's a sticky thing. I don't want to. Yeah.
And I think the power is attached to it too. When you die to self and you step in faith and you do something that would normally be absolutely, you're sure God is leading you that way. Then you start to see His power come in supply and in direction and in hearing His voice and all those things. But as long as you are running the show, as long as you're still in control, then you don't see the power.
So why don't we move into that, because that's some of the things that I at least was going to talk about, and talk about some of the movements that have happened that got us to that place. So again, Taylor will use these phrases, and I think I've talked about them in previous weeks, but I'll just put another finer point on them. That he talks about the individual self moving from the porous self to the buffered self. These are the terms he uses. Okay, and what he means by that is that the person of sort of 500 years ago and beyond, before the modern era, we live in an enchanted world. And within the enchanted world, nature itself has a way of acting upon us. We're more fluid individuals, that we think of the world as sort of being able to affect us directly. Certain things happen, like you would see like storms and thunder has a sort of spiritual, enchanted essence to it, that this is being communicated to us. And the porousness of the self, I'm just putting this very kind of reductionistically, is we are moved about by the rhythms of nature. We sort of live within it and are moved that way. As the modern era progresses, we become more buffered. We begin to harden that exterior. We become more brains on sticks, is what I would say. We begin to think more with our minds rather than feeling with our bodies. And what ends up happening is that now things in nature, certain ideas, they're not porous, they're not flowing in us and affecting us. We look at them, we think we look at them objectively as a buffered individual who then gets to determine with my own choice whether or not I want to absorb it or not. Okay? That begins, by the way, so I'll jump ahead here, in the Enlightenment period. The reason why the Enlightenment period begins in 1650, and by the way, it doesn't begin in 1650. These dates are general, okay? They're all debated. So these are only, the idea that the Middle Ages is from 500 to 1500, for instance, is like, that's a general sense of what we're talking about, but you can't pinpoint it by any means. So understand there's a fluidity to this. When people talk about the Enlightenment, which is this era of, first of all, on the positive side, this innovation in sort of reason and science and all these things, it's also an era of deep skepticism. It begins largely for many with the death of René Descartes in 1650. So again, here's where I'm talking about individuals who at least provide us with markers. And I don't want people to run away thinking like René Descartes was really this big change or Kant affected all this change or whatever. It's just that we have certain individuals whose ideas sort of put a fine cap on, right? So Hegel, the great philosopher of the 19th century, says when we get to Descartes, we've arrived at modern thinking, okay? Why? Anybody know anything about René Descartes, for instance, French philosopher? So Descartes wrote in his Meditations, he basically, you're dealing with an era of the Enlightenment that is defined by its mistrust or distrust of authority, right? That with the end of monarchy, aristocracy, the sort of the forms, you got to understand the kind of ancient world works by a very clear hierarchy, right? Society was placed within a certain hierarchy that everybody sort of fits into. As in, like, if you are a peasant in 1300, you understand yourself as being sort of divinely ordered to be a peasant, if you will. That's your place in the world. Nowadays, we see this sort of mobility of like, I can become a king. Right? Meghan Markle can marry into the royal family and leave it. Okay, we think of ourselves as like millionaires lying in wait. You know what I mean? We kind of move through that's not so much the understanding in the ancient world. You kind of have your caste system. You fit within a certain place. If somebody is a king, they have been divinely ordained to be a king. Okay, they're different than you are in that way. That gets torn down. This begins a radical skepticism emerges, which finds its end, by the way, and this is always kind of the end key date, or the key date to sort of end the Enlightenment that I would focus on would be 1789 in the French Revolution. You also have the birth of America and its democracy and all that going on, but the French Revolution is, I feel like I'm my father talking through me right now, but you can't underestimate or undermine how important that was with the beheading of Louis XVI and what happened in France during that period in Europe. You had the overthrowing of a monarchy by the Committee of Public Safety. This is Rousseau, this is Robespierre, trying to reinvent society without its religious underpinnings. Like from a completely secular standpoint. Like they even changed the calendar. Because like what year is it? It's 2023. Since when? The birth of Christ, right? I mean, they got rid of that, okay? They tried to reinvent it. And what ended up happening was the deaths, like 16,000 people murdered by guillotine. Like it was called the Reign of Terror. the failure of the Enlightenment project was put on full display at that time, okay? Now, did the Enlightenment bring some good things? Of course, but that era is kind of marked by this utter failure that happened. Anyway, you can go into a whole thing on that history. But so what does Descartes do? Let's go back to that. Sorry if I'm all over the place here. Descartes looks at how do we know anything? Begins to question this idea of, well, what are our basic assumptions? We can't, if we're this sort of era of skepticism, how can I be sure that anything is real? How can I be sure that even I exist? And to simplify it, and just to kind of give you the Cole's notes on this, what he does is the cogito ergo sum, which I have down there, which is the I think, therefore I am, right? Well, what he's really saying there is, I can doubt the existence of all of these things, but all that I can be sure of is that it is I who am doing the doubting. So because I doubt, it's really what it's saying. It's not I think, therefore I am. It's really more I doubt, and therefore I must be a doubting thing. Now, I'm simplifying all of this, but the simple thing to kind of take away from this is that he eventually gets to God and a proof of the existence of God through this, but it's all resting on a skepticism. And this is so important for kind of understanding where we are now and the headspace that we're in, is that there's this great distrust of any sort of system in place that it tries to explain everything. And we all need one. Is that making sense? That's a lot right there. I mean, I'm trying to distill René Descartes in a very simple way, but this part of the reason why he begins, his death sort of marks this Enlightenment era of not just innovations in technology and all these kinds of things that end up happening, or in science and reason and the championing of science and reason, but also this radical skepticism that now undermines everything. And that's, again, the era that we're in. So when you get to, for instance, post-modernity, and that's what you're talking about. Modernity was, we talk about modernity as sort of the last 500 years of thought, basically, where we can trust in reason and science and logic. There's a sort of sense that we can progress, we can move forward. But post-modernity, in a sense, challenges this with this grand skepticism. There are no overarching narratives that tell the whole story. That's what and we're living in that now. That's why this is what we got to deal with. I don't want to be moving too fast for anybody, but this is exactly, so post-modernity gets defined as, Francois Lyotard, one of the main figures, he defined post-modernity by saying the incredulity against meta-narratives. Now let me explain that. Skepticism against grand narratives that explain everything. So when we talk about metaphysics, right, the nature of reality. So a meta-narrative is sort of like the story that everything fits within. Christianity being a meta-narrative, for instance. Well, the postmodern era, they begin to recognize that we've been confused about this for a long time, and we're getting into wars and we're fighting each other and we can't pinpoint it. And really what they end up trying to proclaim is there's really no meaning and no truth. There's just a bunch of opinions, and your opinion matters and my opinion matters in some way, but that's all we got. Now, again, I'm being really reductionistic for all of this stuff, but I'm just trying to pose to you what the kind of general sensibility is for people in our age, right? That if we're living in a post-Christian or postmodern age, it's kind of marked by this overriding skepticism that nobody really has the answer. And that's why one of the things that Christianity, in this book, by the way, David Bentley Hart, who wrote The Beauty of the Infinite, has a really simple way of kind of dealing with postmodernity and going, Christianity is never really, if it understands itself truly, should never be fazed by the understanding of postmodernity or the understanding of that sort of relativism and skepticism, because again, Christ takes on human nature. Christ is a universal humanism. Christ is he's too total for there to be any issue with subjectivity, if you will. Am I making any sense to people? I know that's a big, we've jumped a lot there, but I mean, that's what's being said, is actually Christianity is just absorbs in many ways the best things that came out of postmodern thinking, because there were good ideas there. It's actually a quite sophisticated philosophical movement. It doesn't need to blend all of a sudden into relativism. I mean, one of the things that postmodernism brought up, and postmodernity, again, just so you're aware, as a philosophical movement, because you can talk about it in architecture and literature and the rest. In philosophy, it largely came about in the 1970s by a group of French intellectuals, Francois Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault. These are the sort of postmodern names that we associate most clearly with that movement, okay? Well, people like Derrida, for instance, bring this notion up of like what he says is there's nothing outside the text. If you read a dictionary and you want to find the definition of something, what does the dictionary definition do? It just points you to other words, right? And those other words also have a definition, and it's become circular. And he basically used this to say like, so there's no inherent meaning. It's all just language. And so one of the things, and this is so important, I think, for Christians to understand about where we are now, is that we've moved away from there being objective meaning in the world to simply rhetoric and persuasion. And that's really what it becomes, is that what's appealing trumps a kind of love of truth, beauty, goodness. And it's one of the reasons why I brought that up last week. Truth, beauty, and goodness as the transcendentals, as those things that we refer to as God. God is love. God is, he isn't like truth, beauty, and good. And again, maybe some people would disagree with this description, but this is, to me, the traditional understanding, is that beauty isn't something that God just has. He is the essence of beauty. He is the essence of the truth. Jesus says, I am the truth. I am the truth, okay? The essence of the good, whatever we refer to as those things, we are talking about God. And therefore, there is an infinite sense in which we can understand that, which can bring in all of the subjective turns of the individual who are in relationship with it, okay? Without ossifying it, turning it into a dogma, making it just this clear-cut thing that we can point to, right? Jesus remains a person, not a principle. A lot of stuff there. Yeah.
I think you said a long while ago, or at the beginning, about all things that are good. Mm-hmm. And now truth, beauty, and goodness.
Yeah.
If we see people that seem to exemplify truth, beauty, and goodness,
yes,
would that, without any kind of religious theology or regimen of things that they can say, I believe in this, this, and this, and all that, do you think that is God incarnate?
God incarnate? It's an interesting way of putting it. But yes, it has to be. I mean, if it's actually a demonstration, all truth is God's truth, right? All goodness is God's goodness. And they're made in the image of God. And I mean, this is exactly why it's not us and them. I mean, there's no debate that needs to be had there in terms of, and this is partially, I mean, where I'm saying this is the good news of the gospel is not, has nothing to do with like, well, God's angry and you should just believe in him, otherwise he's going to be pretty upset about it. It's that your fulfillment is, your teleology is in Christ. That's the good news, who's defeated death, by the way, right? I mean, this is the little asterisk, also defeated death. I get this question all the time. I mean, people tend to see the Christian religion, again, in this sense of like, I have to adopt this idea because if I don't, then I'll be punished for it. And that's not what's being said. If God is the giver of life, the creator, and all things, what does the gospel say, right? That all things are created by God through Christ Jesus, right? So for God through Christ. If that's the case, then to move away from God is its own divestment. It's the obduracy of the soul. It's just a wrong move, not because something is, God externally, arbitrarily, whatever, in putting a punishment upon you. It's because your end point is in participation within the godly life. All things that are good participate and get their life from God. That's just a very general sense in which I don't think that's the narrative we've been telling, and that's the problem that I see. Is we have to reconfigure this. Now, oh yeah, maybe we should break actually, because I've really been rambling. We really haven't got to any of the things on this page. But I like that. I hope that's okay. We can touch on them. I'll touch on them in a second. But let's get a coffee here. And as I said, I'm about to defend my dissertation, so that's kind of the big next step for me, is getting through that, and then my CV gets kind of put out into the world after that. I went to Acadia Divinity College the other day to do an interview for a recruitment position with them, which I'll wait and hear back in a few days. But that's it's not part-time, but not totally full-time, if you will. It's sort of a remote work thing. So I am still very much interested to be active in doing these sorts of things. This is... if you do know people who are interested in pastoral ministry, have them talk to me, because I'd still promote Acadia anyway. Next steps for me is just trying to figure out how I can continue to teach. I really, as I said, this has made me, I just feel affirmed in this. It's just, I don't think of myself as trying to become a teacher. I think I'm a teacher, and I just will find any outlet I can. So I really appreciate you guys allowing me that. And let Dan know what your interests are, and we'll carry on. We'll actually formulate a little bit more. I can plan out a bit more. As you know, I kind of jump around here. I've been curious to see how that goes. And I'm actually impressed with the rate of attention that it's receiving, because at the same time, some of this stuff you can get murky really fast. You can get bogged down and stuff. And I don't want to do that, because I don't want us to get caught up with unimportant details. I wanted throughout this course for people to have a general kind of sense, an overarching sense, again, of the story that is being told by Christianity. And again, trying to think about ourselves, where we are. I like using that understanding of narrative. That's how the Bible comes to us. It comes to us through story and narrative. And so often, do you want to say something?
I just wanted to comment just a little bit of my sort of experience when you were talking about the book, The Enchantments of Mammon.
Oh yes,
and
Enchantments
how,
of Mammon. Yeah.
Sort of changed the idea of God, like society has,
Yeah.
with stuff or whatever. I just noticed in talking with a lot of people, and mostly like younger people, they don't really recognize spiritual reality as part of their lives, I find.
No, it's true.
It's, and also just to mention, the French existentialist sort of, the only reality was reality that you put into life.
Yeah.
Reality or meaning that you created for yourself.
That's right. Yep.
That's the only meaning. And so, whatever makes you feel the most alive, is sort of your meaning, And, whether it's going to like you were saying, a workshop for to be an entrepreneur, or whether, it's whether, you have a nature hobby, or whether it could be any number of things. That's your meaning.
Yeah, exactly.
Or whether it is, materialism.
So
it's so hard. Like,
it is so hard.
They don't recognize that they have a spiritual reality.
And that's going back to, thank you for that. Going back to this kind of idea that how do you communicate that the only way they're actually going to receive any meaning in life, or the exhilaration of that meaning, how are they going to understand that they can only find that in the person of Christ? That is not the idea that's in anyone's mind. I think this is also the challenge of evangelizing in general, is that most people who need to hear the gospel think they already know the gospel. It is really a stage of unlearning that we're in, right? That's part of being in a post-Christian age, means actually converting somebody, if you want to use that language, is really an act of having them forget what they think they know, because they don't know. And even many of us in church don't really know. Now, I'm not saying I have some ultimate answer that I have ownership of the truth and I understand and everybody else doesn't. I'm not trying to say that, but it actually has to do with that. I think we've made Jesus too little. We've made him too small. We've made him one option among many. And this is precisely what we deal with in the postmodern age, is that with the rise of individualism, which largely happens in the Romantic period. That's why I have these paintings up. You'll notice this Wander Above the Fog. You've probably all seen this painting, right? This is a high point of Romanticism, was this idea of the individual against nature. The individual can they can take control. We can be our rational minds. We can be sort of the arbiters of our, I am the captain of my ship and the master of my fate, right? This becomes the popular idea. You see this again with liberty leading the people, right? There's many people mistakenly think this is about the French Revolution. It's not. It's actually part of I think the July Revolution it's called. But anyway, leading to liberty, that we can do this, and standing valiantly above the corpses left behind by the revolution. This sort of mastery and control leads to eventually what we're dealing with now, and this is what Taylor again highlights, is that we're no longer living in a place where there's sort of a choice simply between the Christian faith and not the Christian faith. You have so many options in front of you that we're a culture of seeking. Everything and we're inundated by choice. And actually, not a long time ago, 10 years ago or so, a guy named Barry Schwartz, psychologist, wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice. Choice does not, we think, again, is our understanding of freedom being manipulated, thinking that freedom is sort of like my ability to choose, right? No, it's the ability to choose well, okay? When I go to the grocery store and there are 80 different types of pickles to choose from, I don't want that much choice. It paralyzes me. Okay? Our young people, I think, are being faced with a religious ethos in which their choices are so vast and, you can move in so many different directions that they're paralyzed. And they don't see it as... And part of this, by the way, this is maybe the most... one of the most important things to kind of focus on that comes out of a lot of this literature, especially people like McCarraher, but it's earlier, people like John Milbank, I'll talk about him actually in a second, that our social understanding of the world and our economic understanding of the world, that's a superficial boundary. Those things are really often the same. And so one of the things that we're talking about in terms of how we see the world is we see things in terms of economics. We see things in a transactional form, okay? The order of mutual benefit is what Charles Taylor calls it. That is a problem, because that's not the free gift of grace that comes from Christ. It's not all transactional in that same way. We tend to see things only in that form. And how we move around that, how we unpack that, how we kind of live through it is deeply important. So much you can say about that, but I guess I'll stop there. Question?
Yeah, I was not sure quite what the right place to ask this was about, but when I look at the why statement and get down to the real, relevant, and authentic, I sometimes think there's a conflict between relevant and real and authentic, because if the society doesn't see us as being relevant and I'm being authentic and real as a Christian, then I might not be seen as being relevant. In more specific ways, sometimes I was thinking about back when I was involved in youth ministry, and people would say, like, you want to get to know the youth culture, and you want to get to know their music and their language and things like that, because then you can communicate, kind of Paul in Athens kind of thing, get to know the culture, and then you can communicate with the culture. But the thing is, at the time, like, that wasn't me. I wasn't necessarily being real, because I didn't necessarily enjoy some of the music, and I didn't necessarily know the language, and people would know that I'm just being fake because I'd be this 50-year-old guy trying to act like a kid, right? And so I wouldn't necessarily be being real, but then there'd be this conflict, because are you being relevant if you're,
That's exactly right. I think that's why I raised it at the beginning as like it's one of these buzzwords. But what I would want to get at with the meaning, how we can really observe it, is that when we talk about relevant, we don't mean the subjective opinion of the culture as to how relevant we are. I'm talking about the inherent relevance to what the Christian claim is doing, okay? What kind of claim is it making? That in the Logos, all life is made through that Logos. If we can't tell that to ourselves, we don't know that inherently about what we think the Christian faith to be, that it's not an option in a sense, right? And I mean, I'm not trying to coerce people into the faith, right? It's not about that. But I'm saying only in Christ is life found. When we say Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, again, people have such a myopic understanding of what that is. They want to narrow it down to that means like, well, then you have to explicitly just say the sinner's prayer, basically, and then you're in. No, okay? That means walking in stride with Jesus because he is the fulfillment of humanity itself. It's the ground of being. That becomes a big liberal terminology, actually, in the 20th century. People like Paul Tillich using this phrase, that God is the ground of being. But it's true, okay? God is the ground and source of being. If we can think of Christianity in this much larger sense, it's inherently relative, right? It's relevant, sorry. That's kind of what I'm driving at. It's just like, how do we make this bigger? How do we stop putting Christ on a shelf and telling him what he's supposed to be? Stop making him so small. We need to be led by the Holy Spirit, and it will do the work. I mean, that's what you and I were just talking about there, Sue, right? I mean, it's not something I have ownership of that I get to dictate, and I'm not the one who gets to dole out the truth of what this is. It's one of the reasons, too, why the Bible comes to us in the form that it comes to us. If narrative, it's a mythology, not in the sense that it's false, but in the sense that it's a grand construct for how we understand things. And that shift is another shift that's taken place. Is we tend to think of our mythological understanding of the world as being embedded in the realness of the scientific world. It's the other way around, actually. The scientific is what's embedded within the myth we tell ourselves. Okay? It's one of the reasons why, for many people who are dabbling with Christianity and faith, one of the things that becomes, and Willard would be a big proponent of this, is do you know the story? Not about whether you think it's true or not. Don't go there yet. But do you even know what it says? Do you know what the story is about? Are you immersed in kind of the language and what's going on, Do we know? Are you aware that before you even believe in literal Christ resurrection, do you know that story? Do you know what happens there? I mean, because that's what we're forgetting it, right? It's going away. Biblical literacy is just plummeting. And that's a huge problem because all of culture, again, it's kind of going to what I'm saying, like you can't understand history without understanding the Bible. Plain and simple. These are all religious motives. It's always, and it will always be repeated in these mutated forms. Okay? So what is the dominant mythology? Let me just take a look at culture right now. What's the dominant mythology in culture? What's like the number one grossing movie in the world? Right? Movies. Marvel, right? Okay, Marvel Comics. Who's the Christ figure in Marvel Comics? Anyone? Yeah. He'd be the God figure, I guess. He creates everything. Well, Iron Man, right? Okay. What's Iron Man? Tony Stark, okay? He's the Christ figure. He dies in the Avengers, like this is the final film. I know this is one of these weird parallels, but just think about it. Think about what culture is telling themselves. This is what everyone's running to go see, okay? This is what the masses are watching. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it either in the sense of pure entertainment, but just understand what story are we telling ourselves? Who is Tony Stark? He's not a superhuman, okay? He's a regular human being who through the power of science and technology and money is able to control and become the savior of the world. Well, that's the dominant mythology. But he is a Christ figure. Understand that he is totally an image of a perversion, a mutation of, but it's the same story that's being told. Coming to understand the Christian story as this sort of all-encompassing, like all of history seen through it, is something that we need to absorb. It's one of the reasons, again, why when I say go read Augustine's Confessions, what Augustine is doing in that theology is using the language of Scripture as his own. It's one of the reasons why it's so effective. That's how we should be doing theology. That's how you and I should be speaking in community, is through the narrative. We enact Scripture. We live it out as a drama. And that's especially why the tradition of the Catholic Church, for instance, and where we've kind of come from, that emphasis is still very much there. A lot of Protestant churches still practice this. It's not like it's either or. But the idea that, for instance, you follow a church calendar. So you don't just preach on themes, but you preach through the seasons of the church. Well, why do you do that? One of the reasons is because you're acting out the drama of salvation. It really pained me, actually, and this is my small c Catholicism roots kind of coming out here, but it grieved me that every year at the church I was at, there was no Good Friday service, ever. They would just jump right to Easter Sunday. And it's like, if you do not live through the crucifixion, you can't get to the resurrection. And we as a church need to kind of move through those cycles and those seasons. I'm not telling you have to do this. I'm just saying it's a tool. It's a resource, right? That's, again, maybe one of our approaches to church and liturgy has to be this understanding that, and we are liturgical. Don't think just because we're not Catholics and doing all the smells and bells that we're not doing liturgy, okay? You all have one. There's a process and a thing that you're doing and living out. We want to live into that as a drama unfolding, that we're acting it. Those are the images we're putting before ourselves. And we need to change our understanding of them as things we have to do, because that's not the way it should be seen. These are tools for us. They're resources for us to symbolically and in a way that even acts upon the subconscious to commune with the divine. And that's what liturgy is about. It's not, again, kind of going to an understanding I think that so many young people have that like, well, we need to pray and worship God, otherwise he's upset about it or something. That's the simplistic way of. You can't add to the glory of God. You also can't take away from the glory of God. If you don't worship him, he's not any less glorified. Okay? Worship in that sense is not for God. It's for God, but it's for you. Okay? It's for you and your bed. That's what prayer is. Prayer is not trying to change God's mind. It's trying to walk in step with the mind of God. Okay? Again, holistic kind of. You've got me on these tangents. I'm just preaching. I'm not teaching anything, okay? So in the remaining time that we have, we don't have a whole lot, I'm curious maybe what people want to talk about. So I had it on here because we covered, I really enjoyed kind of going through the early church and the kind of movements that happened in the first 300-400 years, Council of Nicaea, all that kind of stuff, this emphasis on human nature. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance, this is a whole other kind of situation now where the Dark Ages are defined as a kind of stage of like unlearning. That's why they're called the Dark Ages, and then you have the Enlightenment, okay? There's no light in the world at this time. It's really more of an age of like, we're just trying to survive. We're not really worried about trying to learn. So there's no development going on in that period. You have the fall of Rome, okay? Empires are being destroyed, and there's now a rebuilding process that has to happen afterwards. Well, by the end of the Middle Ages, when you're getting now into the 11th, 12th, 13th century, you start to see the rebirth now, the Renaissance, a kind of remodeling of that old age of antiquity. Okay? Let's bring back all of this understanding of learning. All of a sudden, the university arises. Okay, and then you have massive developments that begin. So I don't ever want to undermine the sort of historical things that happened that then change the ideas of people who carried on. So I remember years ago, A&E did like the most influential people of the last 2 millennia. Who do you think number 1 on the list of the most influential outside of Jesus? Okay, we'll say that's our answer. But who is the most influential person of the last 2 millennia? Anyone want to take a guess? It's a trivia question. Nope. Good guess. Gutenberg. It was Gutenberg, Johann Gutenberg, because he invented the printing press. And by the time because once you get to an age, that happens in the 15th century, right? 26, something like that. I might be off, but anyway, 15th century. Gutenberg invents the printing press. Points to you, by the way. You won the trivia night. Now you have knowledge being dispersed. able to be displayed. It's very quickly how much this, now, of course, what's the first thing to be printed? The Gutenberg Bible, right? Okay, so this diffusion of information that happens, suddenly the authority of Scripture, for instance, not only being put in the hands of just a religious few, right, of the clerical order or something like that. It slowly shifts, though. You have all these, what happens next? The rise of the public library. Go read Samuel Taylor Coleridge and his sermons and his work on theology. Coleridge, who's the great literary figure, right? He wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner and all these kind of great literary works. Also, just a fantastic writer. So if you read his theology, you're like, this guy was an English major, not like he's really incredibly bright. His commentary on public libraries to me was astounding. He thought it was crazy that people would ever, like, you're going to read for leisure? Like that was like, this is work, this is what we're doing. Then what you have all of a sudden is that authority is not just handed to a select few. People begin to write their own manifestos, their own tracts, okay? And then you have the rise of the public square. Coffee shops arise, and all of a sudden philosophers are hanging out and they're having ideas and things are circulating. You have all this new learning. Well, obviously, in many ways, that's a very good thing, but it removes the sort of central authority of the church, okay? And that's part of the Enlightenment movement that happens. So you have all these things. This largely, I'll just connect it then, going back a little bit, but back to the Middle Ages. So the rise of scholasticism, I talked about scholasticism. That's typically what we associate with people like Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Theologica. Massive works of doctrine, trying to really solidify what is the doctrine of the church and how does it relate to reason and logic. You have during that age the rediscovery of Aristotle. So Aristotle's works are suddenly brought back into the picture. And people like Aquinas absorb Aristotle, and we start going back to sort of Aristotelian categories to make sense of and to understand the Christian faith. Now, the result of that has been obviously in some ways very positive, and I don't want to trash that tradition at all. I mean, the Summa Theologica is an astounding work of theology. But by and large, the word scholasticism has become a very dirty word. People don't like scholasticism because what ended up happening was it became the ivory tower of theology, right? We're talking about people asking ridiculous questions that no one cares about, all right? How many angels could dance on the head of a pin, right? Could God have been incarnate in a vegetable life form? This is a real question. Could Jesus have been a cucumber, right? I mean, like that literally became like, and you're going, you're wasting your time. This isn't of any interest. But the reintegration of Aristotelian categories brought about some really big changes. And I'll just, again, this is one of these ideas that probably way too big to unpack, but I'll just give you a general sense because it's become a major thesis, again, for understanding where we are and how secularity sort of arose, how we went from an enchanted world where sort of everybody believed in God in some capacity to this sort of atheistic understanding. And it has to do with the problem of universal, as it's written there. A way of thinking about reality as such. So you see this already in Plato and Aristotle. For anyone familiar with Plato, might be aware of what Plato called the forms, okay? Where he's talking about what is the essence of reality? What's the ontology of that makes something real? What's the nature of being? So you might talk about something like mathematics or something called Platonic mathematics. The number 3, we all agree that 3 is a thing. But what is 3? Is it real in any way? Like, can you point to a thing that is 3, or is there just 3-ness? Get what I'm saying? This is where it gets very complicated in the sense, but like, so maybe a classic example of the Platonic forms would be like, this is a table. What makes it a table? I have an abstract notion of what makes a table a table. This is a particular table, okay? Is there a form, a perfected form of table that actually exists as a concrete reality that gives being to everything else, right? Okay, this is why, without confusing anybody, if I hopefully am not already doing that, this is where the kind of coming together of Christianity and Platonic metaphysics makes sense because Plato had this notion of the one, the forms, right? Aristotle sort of rejected that and he's still a Platonist in many ways, but he brought a new understanding to what makes a thing is its thingness. It's what it is in and of itself, in its particularity, etc. All this to say, this becomes a major question in scholasticism about what is the nature of reality and how do we understand our language for talking about God as being real. So I'm just going to break this down to give you a clear example of kind of what I mean. We talk about goodness. God is the good, okay? The summum bonum is what Aquinas would call it, right? The ultimate good. God is goodness in himself. Well, you and I, how do we understand good in approximation to the goodness of God? Okay? And there are three basic ways of talking about this, and I won't spend too much time on it, but it's just sort of an important thesis. Okay? These are the terms. Equivocity and univocity become sort of the two ways of understanding. When I talk about goodness, how related is it to the goodness of God? So if I look at Mark and I say, Mark, you're a good guy. Good in what way? Good as, do I mean the same kind of goodness as the way God is good? Or do I mean something completely different? And either the term is equivocal, meaning it means something actually completely different. It's equivocal in its meaning, or it's univocal. It means sort of the same thing. Well, a book was written not too long ago, which has really shaped theology, I think, it's one of the most pivotal works the last 50 years, by a guy named John Milbank, and he wrote a book called Theology and Social Theory. And Milbank was a proponent of a thing called radical orthodoxy. And radical orthodoxy is one of these projects of talking about secularism and trying to reinvent our understanding, trying to tell ourselves a different narrative about what Christian faith is. And his whole work rests on one of these narratives of decline where he basically says one of these scholastic figures, a guy named John Duns Scotus, used the notion of univocity to explain language of God. That when I talk about the goodness of Mark here, I'm also referring to God's goodness in the same sort of way, that we can understand the terms univocally. Milbank's idea, and I'm sorry if this is, again, not totally clear, but just kind of get the basic idea of it, is what he said was, when Scotus introduces this language of univocity, that all things are kind of defined under the same heading of being itself, you now don't need God in order to make sense of anything, because I can just talk about things in themselves. Because the goodness I'm referring to with Mark is the same goodness that I refer to as God, okay? It's the same understanding. It's a univocal language. Is that making any sense? The point is through this whole grammatical conceptual understanding, Duns Scotus, regardless of whether he wished to or not, created a space for secularity to arise. Because he created a way of talking about God without really needing to invoke God. And that's why when you get to, again, breaking it down quite simply, when you get to Descartes, when you get to Immanuel Kant, who will shape things radically in Europe, their notion of God, it's still there in their works, but God sort of sits as like, in Kant's philosophy, for instance, God really is only there to provide a moral framework. He's not really involved in creation anymore. He's not really, the language we use is kind of self-sufficient. And we no longer need to appeal to an external authority like God in order to make sense of things. So I don't need you to pay attention to all of this kind of the whole debate. And it's really quite dense and difficult. The point is there's this shift that happens in language where people begin to start to define things in themselves without relation to a creator. Things can now be defined sort of within their own understanding, let's say. So God might be invoked as a sort of like, well, you need God in order to be a moral principle, but how much does God need to be involved? And that's why by the time you get to those philosophers like Immanuel Kant, David Hume being another one, radical skepticists, they're all deists. And so you have the rise of what's called deism, which is kind of the next stage of like, we're on our move toward atheism. We're on our move toward secularity because now God doesn't need to be involved in the world. He's the great clockmaker. He just winds the thing up and lets it go. And one of the things we really need to wrestle with and why this is still relevant to us, I'll just put it in more practical on the ground kind of terms of what we're dealing with, is what I have written down there in the Enlightenment, is that you now have the rise of theodicy, theodicy is a question of how can you understand evil in the presence of an all-good, all-powerful God? This happens because multiple shifts in history, like catastrophes happen. You have the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. This is actually a major turning point. An earthquake which kills thousands of people. And people are left with this question of how can we believe in a God who actually has agency in the world? How can you justify that, especially with our new rationalistic understanding of the world? How can we make that leap, make that understanding? Okay? A philosopher named Leibniz, he will he'll write a book called Theodicy, and he basically makes this argument about the simplicity of God being what he says is this is the best of all possible worlds. Regardless of the fact that bad things happen, God isn't some arbitrary figure who just creates better or worse kind of situation. If this is the world that is, it's the best of all possible worlds. Well, he's laughed at for that idea. Guys like Voltaire, I don't even know that name. Voltaire comes out, he writes the play Candide, which is like a sort of mocking rebuttal to Leibniz, saying like, this is the best of all possible worlds? Thousands of people just died in an earthquake. Okay? That question arises in a much more dominant way post-Enlightenment. And you and I are dealing with it. So now the problem of evil is maybe one of the biggest hurdles for people in accepting religious faith. I will say I would put it as the main issue in terms of what is blocking people from actually getting involved and kind of opening themselves up to a spiritual reality, okay? And again, this has been a very, very reductionistic kind of understanding, but it moves through this sort of process of creating a kind of language that doesn't necessarily need God anymore, regardless of how much we want to accept Milbank's thesis. That's one question. But it leads into deism. And that's one of the reasons why on this thing that I put up there, it always pauses there. Turning points in Christianity, I sort of put the last one as the end of World War II. The Holocaust we are living in a post-Shoah era, a post-Holocaust era. The Holocaust cannot be underappreciated in today's theological landscape, because it's sort of the final nail in the coffin, I think, for where we are. Because we've experienced genocides before in history, but this is the first major genocide against a religious people, okay? The people of God, okay? How dare you talk about God's agency in the world when that happened? Real question. We have to figure out how we wrestle through this.
It's funny, I know that idea,
Yeah.
but what hits me more is the Holocaust is proof that we can't do it alone. If we
100%. You can take it that, absolutely.
If we can't, in this day and age, with all the technology, after all the works of the Greeks and all that, we're still killing each other. And so how do we get the idea that we could ever do this project called life without God? The Holocaust is my proof that humanity needs God and has no hope without him.
I agree. I mean, and I know it's the funny thing about it. I mean, I raise it to go like, I think this created the situation in theology that's kind of dominated the last 50s, right? And so that's why, is because you were faced with this. As a matter of fact, after World War II, you actually see a profound silence in the theological community. It's like no one dared to write. And then what you ended up having was a sort of challenge against these commonly held orthodox notions. For instance, The Crucified God, which is a book written by a guy named Jürgen Moltmann in the German tradition in the 1970s. The Crucified God challenges the idea that was always held in Orthodox Christianity of God's impassibility. The idea that God doesn't suffer, right? He suffers in the person of Jesus, with that second person of the Trinity. There's an Orthodox understanding. God, in his simplicity, divine simplicity, is impassible. Moltmann threw that idea out and said, no, God has to be passible. Only the suffering God is the God worth worshiping. Well, truth in that statement, but you're dealing with now this struggle and this tension to understand providence in any sort of traditional sense in the wake of unbelievable and extraordinary evil that was permitted to happen, right? How did it happen that way? And Christians are so complicit in the Holocaust that this creates another problem. But then you also have people like Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who are the Christians who spoke out again. They were the minority, but they were there. And they wrote the Barmen Declaration, and they fight against, they join the resistance, they fight the Nazis. It's another sort of sense in which, like, faith emerges out of this, for sure. You could take the narrative and move in a different direction, but I am highlighting it as this is certainly what we are in, a culture that is dealing with the aftermath of all of this. And it's still difficult to talk in actual terms about a God who we can pray to, who's going to answer our prayer. Like, what are you talking about? 6 million Jews died. They didn't have a prayer? That was it, like, right? And I think Christianity will benefit at least from sharing in that outrage a little bit before we move to some quick moral answer about how we can explain it all away. It's not about that. Another highly recommended reading, actually, I should have put it on there, is called The Doors of the Sea by David Bentley Hart. And the reason why I will recommend that, again, maybe a dense work because David Bentley Hart is crazy smart, but he wrote it originally as a New York Times piece, and then it evolved into a book. So it's a little bit more easy to kind of enter into. And it's a work basically of theodicy, exploring he tells it The Doors of the Sea because he wrote it after the tsunami hit, what was it, Vietnam? Sorry? Thailand? I tried, I think it was Thailand. Yeah, I think so. And it was like 350,000 people died. Like, it was crazy, right? And he, I think, gives one of the best sort of explanations in that book, very simple book, kind of like 150 pages, for addressing that issue and how we think God in these grander terms and understand evil as being something within creation that is not of God. One of the things that I love about his conclusion in that book is that he really gives no actual meaning to suffering in that way. It's not that we can't derive meaning from our suffering, but there's a kind of basic understanding in his theology that he's going to, suffering is not good in and of itself, okay? That's an important, again, a thing for Christians, I think, to absorb and to understand, is that, like, don't be seeking after suffering as some sort of way of strengthening your faith. It's never good to suffer, but it's always good to be obedient to God, even if it means suffering. Put it that way. Okay? It became a problem in the early church. A lot of people were so taken in by martyrdom as being this, right? That they were willingly giving themselves to martyrdom, and the Christians were going like, don't do that. Like, if martyrdom comes to you, let it come to you, but don't be seeking after the glory of martyrdom. Okay?
Wasn't it one of them
Yeah.
church guys who went looking to be martyred and was disappointed to find out that he wasn't going to be?
Yeah, there's many. There are many stories of that. Right? Because it's just like, and so we're not to romanticize suffering, and that's another thing that's been a problem. That's all a part of, actually, that's part of the kenotic problem, is that the interpretations of kenosis sometimes make people think of suffering and poverty as goods in themselves. And it's like, that's not quite it, yeah.
Like those people who, in different countries, they carry the cross and they,
Yeah.
bleed and they struggle and somehow that's supposed to be redemptive in some way.
Right. Exactly. Right. So, and so, by the way, the going to this bigger sense in which we see the Christian faith. It is 12, by the way. You can all go if you need to. I do want to be sensitive to people's time. I'll say this final thing, though, about just putting a fine cap on some of this, that the answer to these questions wasn't left between this sort of binary understanding here. People like Aquinas adopted what you have there, the analogia entis, the idea that we don't speak of things purely in equivocal terms or univocal terms. We speak about them in analogy. That the goodness that I'm talking about when I refer to Mark being a good guy is analogous to the goodness of God, but God's goodness is always infinitely more than the goodness I can apprehend. Okay? And this is, so actually returning to that notion, speaking in a sense that everything good in the world is an analogy to God, is a way of reconceptualizing, I think, the Christian faith that's really helpful for us today in terms of the story that we're giving other people, in terms of how we remain relevant in what we're saying, is that we are, in essence, we're saying that the Christian faith absorbs and makes sense of everything that is good that aims at this end, and it doesn't limit itself to any one particularity. It doesn't close the door on anything. It is infinite in its modality. It can continuously work in that direction, but it doesn't recognize evil and any of that as a substance that can work against it in any positive sense. Maybe I'm confusing everything at the end there and just jumbling a bunch of words, but that's at least how it sounds in my head. I want there to be this more comprehensive understanding of sort of the history of how Christianity has moved through these different epochs, these different shifts that we have, and that right now we find ourselves in a space, I think, where the paradox of choice, the comfort of living, the sort of things that Christianity has actually gifted to culture that we now take for granted, has created a sort of spiritual malaise in our culture. And there's no easy way to kind of spur people into the faith. It's going to be a long process. And it's going to be the work of the Holy Spirit. It's got to be our faithfulness, going back to the scripture reading that we began with, and our resilience, our ability to stand firm, that will carry through the ages. Okay? That God won't be defeated, right? It will find its way through. What are we committed to? What are we obedient to? Where do we stand in relation to the world such that we can guide it along, we can absorb it, we can bring it into that narrative with us. I think that's maybe the point I'll end on, is just kind of saying that. Does anyone have any more questions about, there was all the Reformation stuff, all kinds of things. Again, we didn't have time, but I just wanted to give an outline. Thank you again for being a part of this. Really interested to do more with you in the future, and I've had a great time, and I hope you benefited from it in some way. Thanks.